Now joining us as the first guest ever on Rebel Headquarters, Congressman Jamie Raskin, who is one of the top progressives in the country and in Congress. He's also a former constitutional law professor. When he was in the Maryland State Senate, he fought for same-sex marriage, for a death penalty repeal, national popular vote for the president, and the list goes on and on. Welcome to Rebel Headquarters, Congressman Raskin.
Cenk, it's totally my pleasure. I'm delighted to be with you and to be your first guest. What an honor.
Terrific. So look, I want to talk about the proposal you have regarding the 25th Amendment and how to get Donald Trump out of office, which sounds wonderful to me. But before we do that, I wanted people to have a little bit about your background, know about your background a little bit. You just recently won a campaign and you were not the incumbent, you were not the favorite of the establishment. How did you get into Congress in the first place?
Well, it was an open seat, and it turned out to be the most expensive primary in US history. There was more than $21 million spent, the vast majority of it not by me. One of my opponents spent 15 million, another spent 3.5 million, and I think we were able to raise over 1 million, maybe 1.4 or something like that. But we had very powerful grassroots organizing. We had our Democracy Summer Project for college and high school students, where we educate them about the history of progressive movements and democratic politics and how to do it. But most of all, I had a track record of fighting with the progressive social change movements in Maryland, and I led the fight in the Maryland Senate to abolish the death penalty, which we did after 4 centuries, to pass marriage equality, and we became the first state in the union to do so without being told we had to do so by our state Supreme Court. We restored voting rights for the former felons. We passed the toughest gun safety law in America, banning military-style assault weapons, banning high-capacity magazines, imposing a universal criminal background check with fingerprints and so on. And we passed great environmental legislation. We increased the minimum wage. We had strong pro-labor legislation, and so I had a record to run on, and we had progressive politics. So I like to say to candidates around the country, you don't need to spend the most money. You just have to have enough money to get your message out, and then you need to be doing organizing. And I've always opposed the model of politics, which is centered around pollsters and consultants. And I always put whatever money we've got into organizing and to invite people to come and knock on doors with us and organize for real change. And it succeeded in 2016. So in the House, I'm on the Judiciary Committee. I'm on the Oversight and Government Reform Committee. I'm on the Committee on Administration. I'm one of the vice chairs of the Progressive Caucus with my friend Pramila Jayapal. And we're fighting for a tough progressive agenda every single day.
Yeah, no, look, I love that story because I want people to understand that real progressives can win even against overwhelming odds or overwhelming finances. And as long as you've got that track record and people believe in you and you actually reach out to the community, you can win. And that's how Congressman Raskin got into Congress. So now let's talk about what you're doing inside Congress. So what's this bill that you've proposed regarding the 25th Amendment?
Well, I was as alarmed as everybody was right when I took office back in January. And of course, I think the impeachable offenses began to mount at that point in terms of continuing collection of money from foreign governments in violation of the Foreign Emoluments Clause, the continuing steering of money from the US government into the funds, rather into the accounts of the Trump Hotel and Trump Tower and so on. And that's in violation of the Domestic Emoluments Clause. And we saw obstruction of justice very early with the firing of James Comey. But we know that it's very tough to impeach a president. You need a majority vote in the House. You need a 2/3 vote in the Senate in order to convict. Meantime, there was this other problem, which is the downward mental spiral of President Trump. And I remembered about the 25th Amendment, which was adopted exactly 50 years ago in 1967. It's tucked in between some other progressive constitutional amendments. The 23rd gave DC the right to participate in presidential elections. The 24th abolished poll taxes, and the 26th lowered the voting age to 18. But the 25th Amendment set forth the procedures for filling vacancies in the presidency and the vice presidency. And so Section 1 says if the president's gone, the vice president takes over. Section 2 says if the vice president's gone, the president nominates, and it goes to the House and the Senate for majority vote. Section 3 says the president can temporarily surrender power to the vice president in the event of a temporary incapacity. And we saw that in a number of points. For example, when President Reagan had colorectal surgery, he turned over the powers of the presidency to Bush and then resumed them by writing a letter. But what we're talking about is Section 4 of the 25th Amendment, which has never been activated. But what it says is that the vice president and a majority of the cabinet, or the vice president and a majority of a body to be set up by Congress, can determine that the president is unable to successfully discharge the powers and duties of office for either physical or mental reasons. And the cabinet, of course, is always there, but the body was never set up. When I first got in, the first thing I started to look for is, well, where's the body that Congress set up? And I called over to the Library of Congress, to the Congressional Research Service, and I said, where's the body set up under the 25th Amendment? And they did some research and they called back and they said it's never been set up. So that became, I think it was my first bill, HR 1987, to establish the body called for in the 25th Amendment. Now, understand the importance of that, because the president can fire the cabinet. If the cabinet is asking questions about the capacity of the president to operate successfully in office, either for physical reasons or mental reasons, or even if the president disappears or is kidnapped, or all of those kinds of scenarios were considered by the authors of the 25th Amendment. The president could theoretically fire a cabinet that was about to declare his or her incapacity. But the president cannot fire the body set up by Congress. And that's why the 25th Amendment talks about a body being established by Congress. You still need the vice president to be involved. So it can't be a coup by Congress. But if things get really out of control, and it's clear that the president is starting to have a break with reality, for example, or the president were to have a coma, or a president were to suffer from serious memory loss and not understand what he or she is doing, at that point, the body could act in conjunction with the vice president. So there's a bicameral nature to it, because Congress has to set the body up, both sides. There's a bipartisan nature to it today, because the vice president has got to be involved. But it's a matter of serious concern, because as Birch Bayh and Robert Kennedy said, who were the main sponsors and movers of the constitutional amendment, they said, we've got 535 members of Congress, but we only have one president of the United States.
Yeah, serious memory loss. Like, for example, if the president were to say on a day like today that he had never met or does not know any of the 19 accusers, women who said that he either sexually harassed or sexually assaulted them, but it turns out he was actually on TV with several of them, which is very, very provable and fairly recent, and had business arrangements with others, but says he can't remember any of them. I don't know if that's pathological lying or massive memory loss, but it is something perhaps worth investigating.
It could be delusional behavior. You know, some of the psychiatrists say he actually is not lying, in the sense that he doesn't understand what he's saying. He simply has misplaced the boundary between truth and fiction at this point. He doesn't know the difference. And that really is delusional behavior. And a lot of the psychiatrists are saying that he's decompensating. He's beginning to fragment in terms of his mental processes. And today's tweets don't contradict that impression. So the whole point of setting up a body, however, is to remove it at least one step from the political process. The body would be composed, as I've written the legislation, of former statespeople. They could be former presidents or vice presidents or attorneys general or secretaries of state, defense, or treasury, and physicians and psychiatrists. And together, they would be available to make a judgment about the capacity of the president in conjunction with the vice president. And a lot of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle don't like the fact that we've introduced this legislation. It now has, I think, 54 co-sponsors, They don't like that fact, but they don't like the fact that the 25th Amendment is in the Constitution, but it is, and it's there for a reason.
So Representative Raskin, real quick, one more thing that I want to understand about this. So is it a majority of Congress that has to set up the body? What kind of vote do you need in Congress? How many people need to be in the body? And what kind of a vote do you need there to say, no, the president is actually incapacitated?
Okay, a majority of Congress can establish the body, and that's under the terms of the 25th Amendment. And we can also define the body because of the 25th Amendment. It's up to us how to define it. And I think we should have hearings, and we should have discussion. And I'm not making a fetish of the particular composition of the body as I've set it forth now. I'd love to have other people's thoughts. But once the body is activated by Congress in the event of a crisis, the body could act in conjunction with the vice president. And if they declared that the president was unable to discharge the powers and duties of office, then the president would be ousted until the president says, I'm ready to resume, or there's nothing wrong with me. And at that point, the vice president stays in power, continues to have the power, but Congress has to meet. And Congress would meet, and within 21 days has to declare whether it believes that the president is in fact incapacitated, and that would be by a 2/3 vote. And if he is, then the vice president would continue to exercise the powers of the presidency as acting president. Or if not, then the president would resume the powers. And that's all in the 25th Amendment. That's how it's set up. All our legislation does is to define the body and to set it up so it's ready to act in the event of a crisis. When in the event of an emergency, break the glass.
Yeah, well, one could argue we're in the middle of that emergency. But yes, so really interesting. And the idea, like all these things that were previously unimaginable, if he's declared incapacitated and he does not agree, he would still be there, but the vice president would then have the duties of the president. And we would be living in an really interesting, surreal world. In a world where we have two popes, I guess that's also possible. But I love that you're doing the hard work to lay the groundwork for that. So if people want to find out more about Congressman Raskin's proposal, we'll have a link to his website below this video. We'll also have a link to our petition on the 25th Amendment. We obviously agree with the congressman on it. So check that out as well. So Representative Raskin.
Can I just add one more thing, Cenk?
Yeah.
About the duty to warn group, I don't know, but it's got thousands of mental health professionals and psychiatrists and psychologists that are part of it now. And they gave me what they described as their first and hopefully last award for a legislator championing the 25th Amendment. But the mental health professionals are quite alarmed by what they're seeing. And the problem, of course, is, it's like putting the frog in the pot and then increasing the degrees. I mean, we are seeing things that everybody would have been absolutely shocked and flabbergasted to see a year ago, but now we've grown accustomed to the erratic and unstable and dangerous behavior of the president. And those are all quotes from Republican senators.
That's right. All right, Representative Raskin, thank you so much for joining us at Rebel Headquarters. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.